Well, behind all this is the US President Barack Obama's push for peace in the Middle East. He's due to unveil his widely anticipated plan late next month. He's expected to launch it in New York, possibly at the UN General Assembly. It's likely to contain some kind of agreement with the Israelis on freezing settlement expansion, the controversial issue behind the widest rift in US-Israeli relations in years. In return, the US is expected to exert more pressure on Iran. Well, to talk more about this, I'm joined by Ziad Asali in Washington, D.C. He's the president and founder of the American Task Force on Palestine. Thanks for joining us on Al Jazeera. Can there really be a compromise on these settlements? I mean, a temporary freeze on all new building is simply not going to satisfy the Palestinians, is it?
Well, the good news is that all parties have an interest in pushing this forward and getting to some kind of an understanding to start negotiations come September in New York. However, the positions are somewhat awkward, at least as publicly stated. The United States expects a 100% freeze, as do the Palestinians. The Israeli Prime Minister has balked at a 100% freeze, and he also added Jerusalem into the mix right now to complicate the picture. So he would take it off the table for now and for the future, which makes it very hard for the Palestinians to negotiate. Certainly makes it very hard for the Arabs to do their part. However, the impulse to actually bridge the gap is too significant. There will be serious attempt to do something by the time they meet in the United Nations, and it's very likely that President Obama will meet with both Netanyahu and President Abbas in September.
Well, the pressure is really on Obama, though, isn't it, to get Netanyahu and Abbas together, some sort of face-to-face talks on the side of the UN General Assembly. Does he have the influence on both parties to be able to do that?
Yes, of course. You mentioned Iran. I think Iran is a very significant player in this equation, although it's absent. What would make Netanyahu move closer to the American and Palestinian position, of course, is his serious concern about what is happening in Iran and his need for the United States to intervene in a meaningful way to neutralize the position of Iran that is being considered
so you're saying
as aggressive.
That the US could use the idea of putting pressure on Iran, maybe more sanctions, getting tougher against Iran as a way of pushing Netanyahu into some sort of compromise over the settlements and the freezing of the settlements. But how much leverage is that really for the US with the Israelis? Because, I mean, the US has shown that it's prepared to be tough on Iran anyway, whether or not they get a compromise out of the Israelis.
Yes, there is actually a confluence of positions between Iran and Israel on the United States. In fact, several Arab countries share that position in trying to check the aggressive ambitions of Iran in the region. However, it is also an existential need for the Israelis to have this problem resolved, and this is some leverage. Of course, you know, politicians will not tie in these two issues together and accept a linkage, but there certainly is a linkage. And the other thing is that what we're talking about in a freeze is really not such a very significant issue in and of itself. We're talking about a process that leads to negotiations. We're not talking about negotiations. Now, all these positionings that the various parties are taking now are not substantive. They are just a process that leads to negotiations.
Indeed.
Negotiations will start not any time before September. Yeah. So there is
it's the usual talks about talks, isn't it, that we always seem to get. Is it right, do you think, to use...
Yes, only this time we have a president of the United States.
Yes, that's the difference.
Sorry, I was saying only this time we have a president of the United States who is actually defining the national interest in such a way that resolving the Palestine-Israel issue is in the national interest of the United States.
Indeed,
that carries a lot of weight.
Indeed, that seems to be probably the only thing that's really moved. I mean, in some ways it feels that we're almost further away from some sort of Middle East peace plan than, say, back in the 90s when Arafat and Rabin shook hands at the White House. Then at least you had a Palestinian leader, of course, who effectively had the lead of all the Palestinians rather than a split Palestinian faction. I mean, now we've got Hamas and Fatah who are separate. You're not dealing with one Palestinian leader.
Yeah, well, I think that issue is probably being dismissed at the moment. I think having emerged from the Fatah conference empowered and considered a leader, not just a president, President Abbas will be empowered to negotiate on behalf of the PLO. And I don't think that will present a problem. I think Hamas will be kept in the loop in some fashion, but they will not be admitted to the negotiations. The bigger problem, of course, would be how to bridge the gap between the significant parties, both in Palestine and Israel, enough to move the ball forward as the issue of Iran and other strategic interests in the region are interlocked. There is a potential, in fact, of having Iran either modify its position or face an Israel that's close to the United States with several Arab parties that are willing to give enough concessions now to move this process forward.
All right, Ziad Asali, we must leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us from Washington, D.C.
Still to come on this hour of news on Al Jazeera. Signs of hope for some, as bright economic numbers are forecast for a few of us.
His ideas and ideals are stamped on scores of laws and reflected in millions of lives.
And tributes to Teddy, the US mourns the loss of one of its most famous politicians.
But first, mourners in Iran